The unraveling did not begin with an explosion. It began with silence, an unsettling, hollow silence that swept across the halls of USAID like a winter draft passing through a house built on decades of careful, bipartisan craftsmanship. For years, the agency had been a living organism, phones ringing with urgency, analysts hunched over maps of drought-stricken regions, logisticians coordinating convoys across impossible terrain, and diplomats stitching together fragile partnerships in forgotten corners of the world. But on that morning, the lights were still on while the work itself had been abruptly extinguished. Employees arrived to find their badges dead, their passwords wiped, and their offices sealed behind locked steel doors. Screens that once displayed real-time updates of global crises now glowed only with stark login errors. The heartbeat of America's humanitarian engine had flatlined without warning. Around the world, the impact struck even faster than anyone anticipated. From refugee settlements in Jordan to cholera wards in Haiti to food distribution hubs in East Africa, U.S. partners waited for guidance that never came. Supplies that should have flowed like lifelines through a network of global cooperation suddenly stopped midstream. Doctors who depended on American support stood in makeshift tents under blistering heat, staring at rapidly dwindling medicine cabinets. Local workers asked where the funding had gone, why the payrolls had stopped, why the promised materials weren't arriving. But no one had answers. Washington had gone dark. Entire programs that kept water clean, children fed, storms predicted, farmers trained, and extremism countered, froze in place, suspended in a kind of bureaucratic purgatory that bordered on cruelty. Inside Washington, the shock of the freeze ricocheted to the federal ecosystem with the violence of a political earthquake. Veteran civil servants, people who had weathered multiple administrations, ideological shifts, and countless budget battles, could only watch in disbelief as their institution was dismantled not with deliberation or strategy, but with blunt, chaotic force. Meetings were canceled without explanation. Travel orders were revoked mid-flight. Employees stationed abroad received frantic, contradictory instructions. First to remain in place, then to evacuate immediately, then to stand by for new guidance that never came. It was as if the administration had thrown the entire foreign aid apparatus into the air and simply walked away from the pieces falling back down. The confusion was not merely administrative. It was existential. Staff who had spent their careers navigating complex terrains, civil wars, pandemics, famine zones, found themselves helpless in the face of domestic political decisions that undermined everything they stood for. One officer described the moment she realized her entire program had been shuttered overnight. It felt like someone turned off gravity. All the things that held us together, funding streams, reporting structures, partnerships, just floated away. The sense of purpose that had defined USAID's workforce was replaced with a fog of uncertainty and grief, as though a beloved institution had died suddenly and without reason. Meanwhile, Congress, shocked, blindsided, and increasingly alarmed, scrambled to understand what had happened. Appropriators who had spent months negotiating funding packages awoke to discover that billions of dollars they had legally allocated were now frozen without justification. The transfer of power from Congress to the executive branch was not merely a breach of protocol. It was a breach of the constitutional order. Emails flew back and forth across Capitol Hill. Committee rooms buzzed with whispered conversations. Senior lawmakers demanded briefings that were delayed, rescheduled, and ultimately denied. The tension mounted as it became increasingly clear that the administration had not only halted the flow of aid, but had done so unilaterally, without authority, and without even a pretense of legal compliance. What made the moment even more surreal was the administration's refusal to acknowledge the magnitude of what it had done. Public statements dismissed concerns as exaggerations or routine restructuring. Officials insisted that nothing illegal had occurred, that the freeze was temporary, that USAID was simply being evaluated for efficiency. But these claims rang hollow in the face of real-world consequences. As contractors sent layoff notices to hundreds of American workers whose jobs depended on federal payments, as food shipments languished in warehouses abroad, and as thousands of vulnerable communities braced for the collapse of support they relied on for survival, the administration's calm reassurances felt like gaslighting. International allies were equally stunned. Ambassadors from Europe, Africa, and Asia demanded explanations that U.S. diplomats could not provide. Meetings that had once been filled with collaborative planning turned awkward, brittle, uncertain. Nations that had long trusted the stability of U.S. foreign assistance began quietly recalibrating their expectations, redirecting partnerships, exploring alternatives. In capitals around the world, a single question echoed: if America cannot keep its own commitments, who can? The answer, increasingly, was clear. Other global powers were waiting eagerly to fill the vacuum. Back inside the United States, the silence within USAID's headquarters slowly began to turn into something else: a sense of dread. Employees gathered in hallways, trying to piece together the bigger picture from fragments of rumors and leaked memos. Some feared mass layoffs. Others feared that the freeze was only the first step toward dismantling the agency entirely. No one knew what the next day would bring, and the absence of leadership, or even basic communication, only deepened the sense that they were witnessing an unprecedented unraveling of America's global humanitarian mission. And yet, beneath confusion, a deeper truth was beginning to take shape. This was not an accident. It was not a miscommunication. It was a deliberate campaign. A campaign executed with speed, secrecy, and indifference to the legal and humanitarian consequences. A campaign that sought to reshape American foreign policy not through congressional debate or democratic process, but through disruption, swift, unilateral, and devastating. In the coming weeks, the world would come to understand the full magnitude of what had been set in motion. But in that first moment, when the locks clicked shut, when the screens went dark, and when an entire global aid operation fell into silence, the collapse felt both sudden and impossibly vast. It was the end of something enormous, and the beginning of a crisis whose consequences would reach far beyond any one agency, any one country, or any one administration. It was unmistakably the beginning of America's retreat from the world. The illegality did not announce itself with a declaration. It seeped into machinery of government like a slow, invisible poison. At first, it appeared as a glitch, an agency-wide freeze here, an unapproved hold there, funding pathways inexplicably suspended or rerouted without the mandatory notifications to Congress. But the signs multiplied too quickly to ignore. Seasoned appropriations lawyers at the Office of Management and Budget recognized the shapes immediately. The contour of violation, the unmistakable outline of a breach in the legal dam that had protected congressional authority for half a century. Within hours, they were quietly circulating statute pages, highlighting provisions of the Impoundment Control Act with trembling fingers, whispering warnings that the administration had crossed a line that no previous administration, Republican or Democratic, had dared to cross so blatantly. The first wave of panic came from within the legal offices of the agencies most affected. Attorneys trained to interpret the law in its most precise and technical form were suddenly staring at directives that contradicted everything the law required of them. A mid-level career lawyer in the State Department later described a moment with an expression that hovered somewhere between disbelief and fear. She had received an instruction to halt disbursements on a humanitarian contract already funded and signed. When she checked the legal authority for such a move, there was none. When she asked for justification, she was told flatly, "You don't need one." It was a kind of bureaucratic command that seemed small on the surface, but beneath it lay an earthquake capable of cracking constitutional foundations. Contractors across the country soon felt the aftershocks. American businesses, small engineering firms in the Midwest, agricultural suppliers in the South, medical logistics companies on the West Coast, had been fulfilling their obligations, delivering goods, deploying teams, paying workers, and preparing the next phases of USAID and state-funded projects. They had delivered on time, in good faith, according to contract approved by Congress and overseen by federal officials. And then, suddenly, the payment stopped. Not delayed, not reviewed. Stopped. Invoices that had always been processed promptly now sat untouched. Phone calls went unanswered. Emails bounced between offices that no longer had the authority to move money that Congress had already appropriated. The consequences were immediate and ruthless. Companies began running out of cash. Payrolls wobbled. Workers who had no connection whatsoever to the political drama unfolding in Washington found themselves laid off by the dozens, then the hundreds. These were Americans who had built careers supporting development work, engineers building water systems abroad, analysts studying disease outbreaks, logisticians coordinating supply chains for disaster relief. Their work had nothing to do with partisanship. It was rooted in service. But suddenly, they were paying the price for a political decision made without legal basis and without regard for lives caught in the crossfire. Meanwhile, congressional offices were drowning in reports that made less and less sense. Requests for information went ignored. Questions about the legal rationale for the freeze met stone walls of silence. Subcommittee chairs began receiving frantic calls from constituents. Hospital equipment stuck in ports, agricultural shipments trapped in limbo, entire foreign aid missions that Congress had explicitly funded, but which the administration was now withholding as though funding authority belonged to the executive branch alone. Lawmakers who had overseen federal budgets for decades knew exactly what they were witnessing: impoundment, the willful withholding of appropriated funds, a power Congress had stripped from the presidency in 1974 after Nixon's abuses. And yet here it was again, not cloaked in bureaucratic finesse, but out in the open, as if the law were irrelevant. The noncompliance escalated with shocking speed. Reports began to surface that the administration had also violated the Anti-Deficiency Act, one of the most sacred guardrails in federal spending. By refusing to pay contractors for services already rendered, the government was effectively operating on a legal credit, accumulating obligations without the authority to do so. Career officials begged political appointees to reconsider. They warned of criminal exposure, of required reports to Congress and the Government Accountability Office, of repercussions no administration could hope to avoid. But their warnings went unheeded. The message from the top was unwavering: delay, deny, resist, deflect, whatever it took to maintain the freeze. The ultimate showdown came when the dispute reached the Supreme Court. The nation's highest judicial authority weighed the evidence. Contract completed, invoices unpaid, obligations acknowledged yet ignored. It was not a hard case. The court ruled unanimously that the payments were required by law. The administration must comply, fund the contracts, pay the businesses, honor the commitments Congress had authorized. But even this was not enough. The ruling did not bring relief. It brought defiance. Instead of restoring the disbursements, the administration slowed them further, offering partial payments, then contesting others, forcing companies into protracted legal fights they could not afford. It was not merely unlawful. It was punitive, a show of force meant to demonstrate that even a Supreme Court order could be resisted through bureaucratic obstruction. Inside Congress, the atmosphere grew tense, electric, almost surreal. Senators who had witnessed decades of political battles felt something fundamentally different unfolding. This was not a dispute over priorities. It was not a partisan clash. It was a direct challenge to the constitutional separation of powers, a refusal by the executive branch to obey spending laws, court orders, and congressional authority. Seasoned appropriators looked across the aisle and found rare bipartisan unity in their alarm. The power of the purse, the foundational check on executive power, was being chipped away, not with a chisel but with a sledgehammer. Perhaps the most disturbing part was the administration's insistence that nothing improper had occurred. At hearings, officials delivered polished lines about restructuring, review processes, efficiency reassessments. But behind those euphemisms lay a truth that everyone in the room understood. The law had been broken brazenly, repeatedly, and deliberately. As one senator murmured afterward, "This isn't mismanagement. It's a constitutional crisis wearing an administrative mask." And yet, even as the legal ramifications spiraled, the humanitarian impact continued to expand in parallel, compounding the damage. Every halted payment, every frozen program, every abandoned shipment of medical supplies or food aid was another link in a growing chain of consequences stretching across continents. But in this segment of the unfolding disaster, the focus was not yet on the human toll. That would come later. Right now, the spotlight was on the corrosion of legal norms, the unraveling of statutes that had long protected the balance of power, and the slow, grinding realization that the system was breaking not because the safeguards didn't exist, but because the administration had chosen to ignore them. The humanitarian crisis did not erupt in one place. It bloomed everywhere at once, like cracked spiderwebbing across the surface of a dam no one realized was under pressure. What began as a bureaucratic freeze in Washington translated into catastrophe across continents. Programs that once operated with the predictability of a heartbeat suddenly went still, leaving communities that had come to depend on American support stranded in a void of confusion and fear. In refugee camps, mothers lined up for food rations that never arrived. In drought-stricken regions, water purification units powered down because spare parts had not been shipped. In disease-hot zones, clinics shuttered because funding for staff salaries had evaporated. The silence that had started in USAID's locked offices now echoed across the globe, amplifying into something far more deadly. In the Middle East, the first panic rose from within the sprawling refugee settlement camps where American aid had long been a lifeline. A health worker in Jordan, who had coordinated malnutrition screenings for thousands of displaced children, opened her computer one morning to find the system offline. The funding ledger wiped clean. The program she had devoted a decade to was suddenly frozen, with no instructions on what to do next. She watched as parents arrived carrying listless infants, their limbs fragile from hunger, asking when the supplemental feeding packets would be available. She had no answer. The storeroom shelves were already bare. When she tried to contact the U.S. mission, she was met with the same automated message again and again. This line is temporarily unavailable. In sub-Saharan Africa, the collapse of disease surveillance networks had repercussions that scientists warned could cost years of progress. Laboratories funded by U.S. grants, labs that monitored Ebola, cholera, malaria, and emerging pathogens, found their reagent supplies dwindling with no replenishment schedule. A microbiologist in Uganda watched helplessly as the temperature in her vaccine freezer began to rise. The generator had failed, and the funds to repair it had been frozen. She stood before the equipment, hands pressed to the glass, willing the power to return, knowing that each degree lost meant lives lost, each hour delay another step toward an outbreak that could spread beyond borders. When the freezer alarms finally shrieked in warning, no one had the authority or resources to intervene. Meanwhile, in Haiti, a cholera treatment center, already stretched thin by recurring outbreaks, found itself unable to pay its nursing staff. Workers who had stayed through hurricanes, political upheaval, and years of instability were suddenly told their salaries were on hold indefinitely. Some tried to stay anyway, but days of unpaid labor turned into weeks, and they had families of their own to feed. One by one, they drifted away, ashamed but desperate. The last nurse remaining turned off the lights in the clinic and whispered a quiet apology to the empty beds. She knew that within weeks, perhaps even days, the disease would return, and when it did, there would be no one left to stop it. In Asia, farmers who depended on USAID's agricultural training programs found themselves abandoned mid-harvest. A rice farmer in Bangladesh recalled how he stood in his field staring at machinery that had broken down and now lay rusting in the sun. The American technicians who were supposed to arrive that month had been recalled. The hotline for assistance had been disconnected. The new drought-resistant seeds they were promised sat locked in a warehouse thousands of miles away, part of a shipment that would never be distributed. He tried to explain to his neighbors what had happened, why the support they had relied on suddenly vanished. But how could he? Even he didn't understand. He only knew that without the program, yields would drop, prices would fall, and hunger would spread. In the Middle East, an emergency food shipment bound for Yemen was halted at a port, its containers marked clearly with USAID insignia. The pallets inside held high-energy biscuits, life-saving nutrition for children on the brink of famine. But the payments to release the shipment had been frozen. For days the food sat in the blistering heat. For weeks it sat in bureaucratic limbo. Eventually, local workers opened the containers and discovered that the biscuits had begun to spoil. The expiration date was approaching. The shipment had traveled thousands of miles only to rot because a government in Washington had shut down the system that delivered it. The smell of spoiled food drifted across the port, an odor that symbolized collapse of something far larger than a supply chain. Aid workers around the world felt the devastation as if it were a physical wound. These were people who had long accepted hardship as part of the job, who had slept on floors, walked miles through conflict zones, and risked their lives to deliver help into dangerous regions. But what they could not stomach was being rendered useless by political decisions thousands of miles away. A seasoned humanitarian coordinator in Kenya described the emotional blow bluntly. We can handle danger. We can handle logistics failures. We can handle chaos. What we can't handle is being told to stand still while people die. The freeze had transformed them from agents of relief into helpless observers, forced to watch crises worsen without the ability to act. The collapse of global trust was another casualty, one not as visible as empty clinics or spoiled food, but equally devastating. Partner governments, humanitarian organizations, and local NGOs who had worked with the U.S. for decades suddenly found themselves doubting America's reliability. Meetings once marked by collaboration became fraught with suspicion. Diplomats who had proudly spoken of America's commitment to global development now struggled to defend decisions they themselves did not understand. In capitals from Nairobi to Bogota to Islamabad, leaders quietly began seeking out new alliances, new sources of funding, new partners who could commit to stability where the U.S. suddenly could not. Perhaps the most haunting impact of all was a human cost that would never be counted. The children who would go unvaccinated, the illnesses that would go undiagnosed, the crops that would fail silently, the families who would migrate because their communities collapsed. These lives would not appear in headlines. They would not be quantified in hearings. They would simply vanish into the blurred margins of a global system that had cracked under the weight of political decisions made without empathy or foresight. Yet even as suffering intensified, the administration offered no plan, no timeline, no explanation. Officials insisted the freeze was temporary, that reviews were underway, that efficiency required disruption. But these euphemisms offered no comfort to the communities watching their lifelines disappear. To them, the reality was simple and brutal. The world's most powerful democracy had withdrawn its outstretched hand, and in doing so, had pushed millions closer to the edge. The political consequences of the pause did not unfold slowly. They detonated. Within days of the freeze, international corridors that once pulsed with predictable diplomatic rhythms were flooded with confusion, then anger, then something deeper, strategic recalculation. Nations that had long woven their foreign policies around the reliability of American leadership suddenly found themselves standing on unstable ground. What Washington considered a bureaucratic restructuring, the rest of the world interpreted as a deliberate withdrawal, a signal, intended or not, that the United States was no longer willing to shoulder the responsibility it had cultivated for decades. In European capitals, the initial reaction was disbelief. Ambassadors whispered among themselves in hushed voices in marble hallways, trading rumors of what the freeze meant, hoping someone had access to a memo, a briefing, an explanation. None did. Brussels, usually the epicenter of calm, became a hive of urgent meetings. Analysts warned that if the freeze lasted longer than a few weeks, the balance of foreign aid across Africa and the Middle East could collapse. Ministers exchanged looks heavy with recognition. Europe alone could not fill the void America was creating. The uncomfortable truth hung in the room like smoke. If the United States stepped away, China and Russia would step forward. Beijing, ever alert to vacuums, moved quickly. State media broadcast commentary framing the U.S. freeze as evidence of American unpredictability, positioning China as a stable global partner. Delegations were dispatched to African capitals with new cooperation proposals, fresh loans, expanded infrastructure deals, scientific exchanges. To leaders desperate to keep their development project alive, the timing felt less like coincidence and more like a lifeline. For years, they had tried to balance their relationships between Washington and Beijing. Now, the scales tipped without their input, without their consent, shifted by the weight of a political decision made thousands of miles away. Moscow, too, seized the moment with quiet calculation. Their diplomats framed the freeze as further proof that the West was fracturing. Russian state outlets painted a picture of weakening Western resolve, a narrative intended to strengthen their position in regions where they sought influence. In the Sahel, where American-trained counterterrorism units already struggled against resurgent extremist groups, Russian operatives offered security partnerships to governments left exposed by the sudden loss of U.S. support. What had once been an ideological contest between superpowers became a scramble for opportunity. each nation maneuvering to occupy the space America's absence created. In the global South, the reaction was more visceral. Leaders who relied heavily on American aid found themselves thrust into political chaos. In parliaments across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, rival parties accused one another of failing to anticipate the freeze. Protesters filled streets in several capitals, demanding answers as clinics closed and food shipments stalled. Some leaders defended Washington, pleading for patience. Others delivered speeches condemning the decision, insisting their nations would not be held hostage by the internal politics of a distant power. But beneath the public rhetoric lay a deeper, quieter recalibration. If America could vanish from the table once, it could do so again. The United Nations was thrown into a diplomatic crisis of its own. Emergency meetings were convened as agencies reported funding gaps that threatened to halt essential operations. The head of the World Food Program, visibly strained, warned that entire regions depended on American contributions to keep famine at bay. The U.S. delegation sat stiffly through the session, offering vague assurances that the pause was temporary and strategic. But their carefully scripted lines did little to reassure partners who had seen with their own eyes the immediate consequences of freeze. Trust, once broken, could not be restored through talking points. Allied militaries felt the shock too. Joint operations, particularly peacekeeping missions and counter-extremism programs, found their logistics disrupted by the sudden stoppage of civilian aid that had supported them. In conflict zones, community relationships frayed as local partners interpreted the withdrawal of humanitarian funding as abandonment. A commander in a multinational task force confided privately to his team that the freeze had undercut years of hard-won trust. In regions where extremist ideology thrived in the vacuum of state support, America's silence became propaganda material. Militant groups spread leaflets and radio messages claiming that the U.S. had turned its back on the world, feeding narratives of betrayal. Global markets reacted with the same anxiety governments felt. Financial analysts noted that the freeze signaled political instability within the world's largest aid donor. Currency exchanges trembled as investors speculated about the long-term implications for regions dependent on U.S. development pipelines. In some countries, bonds-tied infrastructure projects funded by American grants dipped sharply. Development banks scrambled to adjust forecasts, warning that prolonged disruption could alter global poverty rates for the first time in years. Yet despite the chaos abroad, Washington's official posture remained defiant. Administration spokespeople appeared on news networks, insisting that the freeze was a routine review, a necessary step to eliminate inefficiency. But internationally, that explanation landed hollow. The world had grown used to American bureaucracy, but not American unpredictability. Diplomats began to frame the crisis with new, unsettling question. One whisper behind closed doors in embassies from Berlin to Nairobi. If this could happen once, what else might America walk away from? The most profound shift was psychological. Nations that had organized their foreign policies around American steadiness began to chart new paths, not out of ideological preference, but out of necessity. For the first time in generations, the global order shifted not because the U.S. was defeated or outmatched or declining, but because it simply stepped back. The vacuum it left behind reshaped alliances, redirected investments, and rewrote diplomatic calculations. The world did not collapse. It adapted, but adapted away from the United States. And as leaders everywhere adjusted to this new geopolitical landscape, one truth became undeniable. Inside the United States, the fallout from the aid freeze did not arrive all at once. It seeped, slowly at first, like a hairline fracture spreading beneath the surface of a seemingly solid structure. Ordinary Americans, busy with their routines, barely noticed the initial tremors. But beneath the calm exterior of everyday life, pressure was building in all the hidden spaces where foreign policy quietly ties itself to domestic stability. The freeze had not just halted global programs. It had disrupted industries, undercut local economies, destabilized security frameworks, and sent ripples through communities that had never imagined their futures were linked with faraway development missions. The first signs appeared in places most Americans had never heard of: manufacturing towns in Ohio and Pennsylvania, small tech hubs in Colorado, logistics corridors in Georgia and Texas. Companies that supplied equipment, software, vehicles, medical kits, and agricultural tools to international programs suddenly found their contracts suspended or canceled. Executives scrambled to reassure investors, but the truth was unavoidable. Without federal payments, payroll obligations turned into dead weight. Factories slowed, then stopped. Workers were furloughed. Some were laid off entirely. For the first time in years, local news networks carried stories of middle-class families facing eviction because of a foreign policy decision made in Washington that they only dimly understood. The political reaction was more explosive. Congressional offices were inundated with calls and emails from constituents demanding explanations. Many had never cared about USAID before, but when jobs vanished, when communities lost millions in canceled contracts, when local governments faced widening budget gaps, the abstract became painfully real. Town halls turned tense. Representatives, Democrat and Republican, found themselves standing before angry crowds, trying to explain how an executive action could override legally appropriated funding. Their answers were either cautious or furious, depending on their party, but both sides share a common thread. They lack clarity. The administration had offered no transparent justification, no strategy, no timeline, just silence. Cable news seized a moment with the ferocity of a storm. One network framed the freeze as a heroic act of draining the swamp, another as a reckless and unlawful attack on American credibility. Panels of analysts debated constitutional law, executive authority, global security, and domestic economics in breathless cycles. Commentators spoke as though the nation was witnessing a constitutional stress test in real time. The volume of the debate rose until the freeze was no longer a policy dispute. It had become a symbol of something larger, a referendum on the direction of the country itself. Inside the administration, the atmosphere was no calmer. Senior officials, previously confident in their messaging, began to sense the political costs rising around them. Advisors clashed behind closed doors. Some argued that the freeze should be defended at all costs, framed as a triumph of American sovereignty. Others warned that the damage, to alliances, to Congress, to domestic stability, was spiraling beyond control. Leaked memos revealed internal confusion, divisions about the legality of the freeze, fears about looming lawsuits, warnings of economic consequences that could widen into political disaster. But while factions argued, the freeze remained in place, immovable, inflexible, and increasingly toxic. For civil servants across the federal government, the crisis took a different emotional toll. Agencies that had always worked in quiet, methodical harmony with USAID found their operations disrupted. Analysts at the State Department reported intelligence gaps caused by the loss of field programs. Economists at Treasury flagged potential shocks to emerging markets. Homeland Security officials raised alarms about instability in regions where extremist groups could exploit the vacuum. Yet despite the warnings, their concerns were dismissed or downplayed. It became clear to many that expertise, once valued as a foundation of policy, had been eclipsed by politics. As the weeks dragged on, the national mood shifted from confusion to unease. Uncertainty seeped into conversations at dinner tables, workplace break rooms, and college campuses. Americans argued not just about the freeze, but about the country's identity. Were they witnessing a bold act of redefinition, or the first cracks of institutional collapse? Was the U.S. reclaiming itself, or abandoning what had long made it a global leader? The divide widened until it felt less like political disagreement and more like two realities running in parallel. Then came the lawsuits. State governments joined contractors, NGOs, and retired diplomats in filing legal challenges against the administration. Governors from both parties condemned the freeze, citing economic harm to their states. Legal scholars debated the implications on nightly broadcasts. In courtrooms, lawyers argued that the move violated the Constitution's separation of powers. Judges issued temporary injunctions, some of which the administration ignored or appealed. The judiciary, once a quiet spectator, was thrust into the center of a political storm. The crisis reached the national consciousness fully when American soldiers began speaking out. In interviews, op-eds, and private letters that leaked to press, service members warned that the freeze endangered missions abroad, undercut alliances, and weakened stability in regions where their lives depended on local trust. The public listened. Opinions shifted again. Supporters of the freeze accused the military of overstepping. Opponents accused the administration of jeopardizing national security. Military families, caught in the crossfire of political rhetoric, demanded answers that never came. And yet, amid the chaos, something else happened. Something quieter, unexpected, and transformative. Grassroots coalitions formed across ideological lines. Aid workers stood beside factory workers. Diplomats beside veterans. Conservatives who valued global stability stood beside progressives who valued humanitarian commitments. Communities that had never spoken to each other suddenly found themselves united by a simple truth. America's role in the world was not abstract. It was connected to jobs, to safety, to values, to identity. The freeze had not just disrupted foreign programs. It forced Americans to confront the question of what kind of nation they wanted to be. In the end, the domestic reckoning was not merely about USAID or foreign assistance. It was about power, how it is used, how it is checked, and what happens when it goes unchallenged. It was about the fragility of democratic norms that many had assumed were indestructible. It was about the realization that institutions could be shaken not by foreign enemies but from within.